As the current custodians of Darksiders, one of my favourite IPs, I considered supporting Gunfire Games' Remnant from the Ashes at launch, but I have an on-off relationship with Souls-like games and avoided it. I'm someone who enjoyed Darksiders 3, despite the change in the combat style, but I find it a much better game since they reintroduced the classic mode, shifting it closer in style to its predecessors. When Remnant from the Ashes arrived on Game Pass, I had no excuse not to give it a go, but gave up after several frustrating solo runs with different starting classes. With only 2 muted DLC drops, it feels like the game dropped entirely out of the news cycle within a year of launch, after an equally low-key next-gen upgrade last year, and primarily to give Gunfire Games more money towards what I hope is Darksiders 4, I picked up Remnant from the Ashes Complete Edition cheaply, and committed myself to find the time to take it slow and get a better feel for the mechanics. I finally got back to it a year on, and now, 25 hours later, with one solo campaign completed and another character for some multiplayer in the adventure mode, I've been unexpectedly entertained on a mechanical level, despite the limited scope, uneven single-player balance, and mixed production values. In brief, Remnant from the Ashes is a single-player or cooperative third-person shooter, combining Souls-like progression and a roguelite world structure. Enemies hit hard, bosses harder still, you've got limited healing options, at first, and death sets you back to the last checkpoint with the basic enemies respawned. Each time you enter a new region, the world is seeded, providing a unique layout, a selection of optional dungeons and encounters, boss variations, and gear to find. You're always gaining XP towards upgrading passive trait cards, along with materials and scrap needed to craft or upgrade gear, but notably, nothing is dropped on death. There's also an incredibly light narrative thread that, despite the extensive lore, a prequel game, some verbose conversations, and pretentious item descriptions, boils down to a key NPC in each region, sending you to kill the big boss of said region. Even 4 years ago at launch, it was treading familiar ground, but to its credit, it's one of the few attempts at Dark Souls with guns that actually works. To explain why Remnant from the Ashes clicked with me, I need to provide a little context. I'm a methodical and predictable gamer, always taking the slow and steady approach, exploring every location to the fullest, and tackling every quest before moving forward. It's a pattern I struggle to break out of, even when a game lets me or incentivizes me to do so. Unexpectedly, Remnant from the Ashes' attempt to be a little bit of everything satisfied my need for a continuous sense of progression and systematic exploration, though I suspect several design decisions bored both Souls-like and roguelike fans. Starting with the difficulty, always an important and divisive topic in these genres, it doesn't take long to realize most enemies, elite variants, and several bosses pose little threat if you have half-decent aim and keep your distance. A somewhat problematic design choice, seeing as Remnant from the Ashes is a shooter. As a consequence, difficult scenarios are created by mixing ranged and melee attackers, spawning in elites that can come at you from any angle, locking you into restrictive boss arenas, and boss fights with an abundance of summoned minions. It's a cheap approach, one that favors cooperative play, and this design can result in some luck-based roadblock for solo players, at least in the early game. Playing solo, both for my original Xbox Game Pass attempt and my most recent playthrough, I got stuck with a boss called Gorefist as my first mandatory encounter. A high-damaged melee opponent that summons exploding minions, fought in a confined arena full of overlapping walkways and stairs. Awful luck when my plans were for a long-range glass cannon build. This time, however, I stuck with it, perhaps begrudgingly as I'd spent money on the game. I went back to the overworld, explored a little more until I found an optional dungeon I missed, then returned to the hub area, Ward 13. I suddenly realized I now had sufficient scrap and crafting materials to level up my armor and weapons several times over. I had also found a ring that boosted XP gain by 30%, and had accumulated several trait points to invest during my diversion. Sure enough, my next Gorefist attempt was still tough, given my weapon loadout and choice of traits, but I had the edge I needed to survive and push forward. The reason I focus on this early encounter is that it typifies Remnant from the Ashes structure and measured approach to progression. There's always enough content seeded in each region to keep you ahead, or at least on the difficulty curve during your first run. If you're playing solo, normal offers a smooth enough trajectory, especially if you invest in a summon-type weapon mod to buy yourself some space and time. If you're playing co-op, where other players can split the attention of your foes, hard is the right choice to keep everyone on their toes without it becoming too frustrating during boss fights. If we look at the progression mechanics specifically, the opening region on Earth is full of the basic iron you need to get your gear up to tier 5, and you'll easily gain 24 trait points to invest in some early traits before you move on. Think of upgrading your maximum health, stamina, and a class-specific trait. The pace then picks up when you arrive in Rom, where you'll likely have several boss components to forge some more niche weapons, an assortment of weapon mods, and a selection of rings and amulets to equip. You'll also discover more specialized trait cards, and scavenge the forged iron you need to reach tier 10 gear. On Corvus, galvanized iron makes an appearance, allowing you to upgrade your gear to tier 15, while you'll unlock more situational traits and weapon mods to better define your build. From Yesha onwards, it's all about further refining your build, using traits and accessories, and then pushing your gear score towards tier 20. When it comes to the exploration and questing elements, the seeded then fixed approach ensures you can always systematically explore each region to the fullest, without having to deal with shifting layouts every time you return to the game. Of course, with so much gear and many traits tied to boss components and random encounters, this can feel limiting at first. There's even a chance you'll encounter objects you can't interact with, because the associated quest item is never spawned. However, for those with gear-based FOMO, you can always join another player's campaign, and you retain any components or gear you find while assisting them. If you're not a fan of the co-op or teaming up with randoms, the excellent adventure mode offers the perfect solution for farming. Streamlined mini-regions with one optional dungeon, one world event, and one boss dungeon. Accessible at any time from the hub, and without affecting your main campaign. Both the seeded world design and interconnected game modes provide a near-perfect balance between encouraging methodical exploration, while also allowing you to see everything on offer, and, best of all, without the need for excessive grinding. So far so good if you share my tastes, but Remnant from the Ashes has elements that are objectively weak. The biggest issue, for those that enjoy some narrative context, is the poor storytelling and underwhelming characters. It's an aspect that's especially disappointing coming from the developers who worked on the grandiose and over-the-top Darksiders games. Most quest givers offer an intriguing first encounter, another line or two upon completing a quest, and then are relegated to nothing but generic quips for the rest of the game, no matter how significant an event might have occurred. With the notable exception of the Ward 13 hub, and Ward Prime in the Subject 2923 DLC, there are maybe 2 documents to find per region, and the ending sequences provide only a brief cutscene before unceremoniously dumping you back in the hub, with negligible changes to NPC behavior or dialogue. Sure, character progression and upgrading gear are the focus, but Gunfire games have achieved way more on a budget. The second potential issue is that while Remnant from the Ashes has an immersive atmosphere, great soundscape, and can look fantastic at times, the more I played, the more my mind went back to Darksiders 3, and the less distinct it felt. Now, I'm not one to criticize the reuse of assets, having started gaming in earnest in the late 90s and early 2000s. Hell, many of my favorite games and sequels are built entirely using existing engines and assets. However, by modern standards, Remnant from the Ashes struggles to stand out. A sensation not helped by the fact each map is a sequence of interconnected chunks, rather than smaller scale tiles, so you'll recognize repeating layouts easier. I think a big part of the problem lies in the seeding algorithm for the larger campaign regions, as playing a string of adventure mode quests, even in the same region, does a much better job of highlighting the diversity on offer. Wrapping up, is Remnant from the Ashes still worth playing if you missed it at launch or bounced off it? I'd say yes, and given numerous balance and content patches after launch, it's even easier to recommend. If you're a die-hard Souls or roguelike fan, you might not find the jack-of-all-trades approach and the way it handles difficulty engaging enough, but I think more casual gamers, those with an interest in either genre but without a ton of time on their hands, will find this a brisk, enjoyable, and smartly designed experience, despite some budget limitations. If you fancy the idea of gunning down demons alone or with friends, systematically exploring semi-random worlds that can be re-rolled for a fresh experience, while consistently upgrading your character and gear, Remnant from the Ashes will tick all those boxes, and then some. Like the Darksiders games before it, it sits comfortably in the 7 out of 10 zone. Good, but not great, and mechanically satisfying, but unambitious.